Have you ever wondered what happens when duty collides with the human heart in the most impossible circumstances? When a single moment of compassion could destroy everything you've sworn to protect, yet your conscience refuses to let you walk away. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, sacrifice, and the choices we make when the world around us has lost its mind. Picture this. It's 1944, and deep in the Arizona desert, where the sun beats down mercilessly and the landscape stretches endlessly toward distant mountains, sits a place that history has largely forgotten. A prisoner of war camp that housed thousands of captured enemy soldiers, far from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. This was a world unto itself, governed by strict military protocol and separated from civilian life by miles of barbed wire and armed guards. But within those walls, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would test the very foundations of military discipline, challenge the boundaries between enemy and human being, and prove that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of courage can shine brighter than all the hatred surrounding them. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside one of the most remarkable and forbidden encounters of World War II. A story that was buried in classified files for decades, hidden away, because it revealed truths that neither side wanted to acknowledge about what happens when we see past uniforms to the people wearing them. This isn't just another war story. This is a testament to the power of individual conscience to rise above the machinery of conflict. What you're about to hear will shake you to your core, because it proves that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion isn't picking up a weapon, but choosing to see humanity in those we've been taught to hate. The story begins with Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a decorated military nurse whose reputation for saving lives had made her legendary among the medical staff stationed throughout the American Southwest. At 32 years old, she had already served in North Africa and Italy, had seen more blood and death than most soldiers twice her age, and had earned the respect of every commanding officer she'd worked under. Sarah was different from the other nurses in ways that went beyond her medical expertise. She possessed an intensity that drew people to her, a fierce dedication to healing that seemed to transcend politics and nationality. Her colleagues knew her as someone who never gave up on a patient, no matter how hopeless the case appeared. She moved through the hospital wards with quiet authority, her presence alone seeming to calm the most agitated soldiers. But Sarah carried scars that weren't visible on any medical chart. Her younger brother had been killed at Guadalcanal, torn apart by enemy artillery while trying to save wounded Marines. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1943, and something inside Sarah had hardened that day, crystallized into a determination that death would not claim another soul on her watch if she had anything to say about it. The Arizona camp where Sarah was stationed had been constructed in haste as prisoner populations swelled beyond the capacity of existing facilities. What had started as a temporary solution had evolved into a complex operation, housing over 5,000 captured soldiers from across the European theater. German officers, Italian tank crews, and various other enemy personnel found themselves imprisoned in a landscape as alien to them as the surface of Mars. The medical facility where Sarah worked sat at the heart of the compound, a series of converted barracks that had been hastily equipped with surgical equipment and hospital beds. It was here that wounded prisoners received treatment for injuries sustained during capture, illnesses contracted in overcrowded transport ships, and the various ailments that plagued men living in confinement thousands of miles from home. Sarah had treated hundreds of enemy soldiers during her time at the camp. Most encounters were purely professional, brief interactions focused on medical necessity rather than human connection. The language barriers, the weight of military protocol, and the simple reality that these men represented everything she had been fighting against created natural distance that both sides seemed content to maintain. But on a scorching Thursday morning in July, everything changed when a new transport arrived carrying prisoners from a recently captured German submarine. Among them was someone who would challenge every assumption Sarah had made about enemies and allies, about duty and conscience, about what it truly means to heal in a world determined to wound. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Weber had been pulled from the Atlantic waters off the coast of North Carolina after his U-boat was depth-charged by American destroyers. At 29 years old, he was young for a submarine commander, but his service record spoke of exceptional skill and unwavering dedication to his crew. The same explosion that had sent his submarine to the ocean floor had left him with severe injuries that required immediate medical attention. When Klaus was brought into Sarah's medical ward on a stretcher, barely conscious and struggling to breathe, she saw what her colleagues saw: another enemy prisoner requiring treatment before transfer to the general population. His uniform marked him as Kriegsmarine, his rank insignia identifying him as an officer who had likely been responsible for sinking Allied shipping and killing American sailors. Yet as Sarah began her initial medical assessment, checking his pulse and examining the shrapnel wounds that decorated his chest and arms, something unexpected happened. Klaus opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and in that moment of connection, she saw not the face of Nazi ideology, but the expression of a man in tremendous pain who was trying desperately to maintain his dignity despite circumstances beyond his control. The injuries Klaus had sustained were severe, but not life-threatening with proper care. Shrapnel had peppered his torso, one piece lodging dangerously close to his heart. His left arm had been broken in 2 places during the submarine's final moments, and burns on his hands and face testified to the hell he had endured as his vessel filled with smoke and seawater. What struck Sarah most during those first moments of treatment was Klaus's behavior. Despite obvious agony, he attempted to follow military protocol, trying to sit at attention when superior officers entered the room, responding to questions with the formal courtesy expected of a captured enemy officer. But she also noticed the way his eyes tracked her movements as she worked, not with suspicion or hostility, but with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. The medical treatment Klaus required would keep him in the hospital ward for several weeks. Unlike other prisoners who were patched up quickly and returned to general population, his injuries demanded ongoing attention that only the medical staff could provide. This meant extended contact between nurse and patient, daily interactions that gradually began to reveal the human being beneath the military facade. Sarah found herself assigned as Klaus's primary care provider, a routine decision made by the chief medical officer based purely on scheduling and expertise. Neither of them could have predicted how this professional arrangement would evolve into something that challenged every rule they had been taught to follow, every boundary they had been trained to maintain. The first conversations were strictly medical in nature. Sarah would check Klaus's wounds, adjust his medications, and monitor his recovery progress while maintaining the professional distance required by military regulations. Klaus would respond to her questions about pain levels and symptoms with the minimal information necessary, both of them careful to avoid anything that might be construed as fraternization. But as days turned into weeks, small cracks began to appear in the walls they had constructed around themselves. Klaus's English, while accented, was fluent and sophisticated, suggesting an education that went far beyond military training. Sarah noticed books among his personal effects, volumes of poetry and philosophy that seemed inconsistent with her expectations of enemy submarine commanders. The breakthrough came during Klaus's second week of recovery, when Sarah discovered him reading a collection of American poetry that someone had left in the ward. The sight of this German naval officer, absorbed in verses by Walt Whitman, created a cognitive dissonance that forced her to confront her own assumptions about who her enemies really were. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident. Sarah was changing Klaus's bandages when she noticed him wincing at a particular passage in the book he was reading. Without thinking, She asked what was troubling him about the text. Klaus looked up, surprised by the question, and for a moment forgot the careful protocols that governed their interactions. He explained that Whitman's celebration of democracy and individual freedom resonated with feelings he had harbored long before the war began, beliefs that had put him at odds with the political system he was sworn to serve. The words came tumbling out before he could stop them, revealing depths of thought and conflict that Sarah had never expected to encounter in an enemy prisoner. That conversation became the first thread in what would grow into a complex tapestry of understanding between two people who should have remained strangers. Sarah found herself returning to Klaus's bedside not just for medical rounds, but drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. Here was a man who commanded a weapon of war designed to kill her countrymen, yet spoke with genuine anguish about the philosophical contradictions that haunted his service. Klaus began to share fragments of his story during the long desert afternoons when the medical ward grew quiet and the heat outside made movement unbearable. He spoke of growing up in a small Bavarian village where his father taught literature at the local school, where evenings were spent discussing Goethe and Schiller rather than military strategy. He described the moment when conscription papers arrived, ending his plans to follow his father's footsteps into academia and thrusting him into a world that felt fundamentally alien to everything he had been raised to value. Sarah listened to these revelations with growing fascination and confusion. The enemy she had been taught to hate was revealing himself as someone caught between duty and conscience, someone who had found himself serving a cause he privately questioned. Klaus spoke of crew members who had joined the Navy to see the world, only to find themselves trapped in metal tubes beneath the ocean, launching torpedoes at ships carrying men who might have been their friends under different circumstances. What disturbed Sarah most was how familiar Klaus's internal conflicts sounded. She recognized in his voice the same struggles she faced every day as she treated wounded prisoners. The same questions about duty and humanity that kept her awake during the long desert nights. The same sense of being caught between the demands of military service and the calling of her own conscience. As Klaus's physical wounds began to heal, their conversations deepened in ways that both thrilled and terrified them. They discovered shared passions for literature and music that transcended national boundaries. Klaus would recite German poetry that Sarah didn't understand linguistically, but felt emotionally. Sarah would hum melodies from American folk songs that seemed to transport Klaus to memories of home and peaceful times. The other medical staff began to notice the extended time Sarah spent with the German officer. Whispered conversations followed her through the ward as colleagues speculated about her unusual dedication to this particular patient. The head nurse, a stern woman whose own son was fighting somewhere in the Pacific, pulled Sarah aside one afternoon to remind her of the importance of maintaining professional boundaries with enemy personnel. But Sarah found it increasingly difficult to see Klaus as the enemy. During his third week of recovery, she witnessed something that shattered her remaining preconceptions entirely. A young German soldier had been brought into the ward suffering from severe dehydration and what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. The boy, barely 18 years old, was inconsolable, crying out for his mother in broken fragments of his native language. Klaus, despite his own injuries and the strict prohibition against prisoner interaction, somehow managed to reach the terrified young soldier. Sarah watched in amazement as the submarine commander transformed into something approaching a father figure, speaking softly in German, offering comfort that transcended military rank and circumstance. The gentle way Klaus calmed the boy's fears revealed depths of compassion that no enemy propaganda had prepared her to recognize. That night, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the nature of good and evil in wartime. Klaus had shown her that humanity could exist even within systems designed to dehumanize, that individual conscience could survive even when surrounded by forces that demanded its surrender. She began to wonder if the real enemy wasn't the men wearing different uniforms, but the circumstances that forced decent people to fight each other instead of the hatred that made such conflict inevitable. The shift in their relationship became undeniable during Klaus's 4th week in the medical ward. What had begun as professional courtesy had evolved into something approaching friendship, though neither dared acknowledge it openly. They found ways to extend their conversations beyond medical necessity, discussing philosophy and literature with an intensity that made them forget, temporarily, the barriers that separated them. Klaus began teaching Sarah basic German phrases, ostensibly to help her communicate with other prisoners, but really because it gave them legitimate reasons to spend time together. Sarah shared stories about growing up in rural Montana, about her decision to become a nurse, about the dreams she had harbored before the war changed everything. These exchanges felt dangerous and precious simultaneously, creating an intimacy that both knew violated every rule governing their interaction. The medical staff's suspicion was growing more pronounced. Sarah noticed the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the meaningful glances exchanged when she spent what others considered excessive time with Klaus. The camp commander had been asking questions about prisoner treatment protocols, ostensibly routine inquiries that felt anything but casual to someone with a guilty conscience. Klaus was scheduled to be transferred to the general prisoner population within days. His injuries had healed sufficiently to no longer justify keeping him in the medical ward, and military regulations demanded his integration with other captured officers. Both he and Sarah understood that this transfer would effectively end their contact, returning them to their respective roles as captor and captive, nurse and patient, representatives of opposing sides in a global conflict. The prospect of separation forced them to confront feelings they had been carefully avoiding. Sarah realized that Klaus had become more than just an interesting patient or even a friend. His presence had awakened parts of herself that years of military service had taught her to suppress. His thoughtful questions about literature and life had reminded her of dreams she had abandoned when she chose duty over personal fulfillment. Klaus found himself facing an emotional crisis that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Sarah represented everything he had been taught to oppose, yet she had shown him kindness and intellectual respect that he had rarely experienced even among his own countrymen. Her dedication to healing transcended the political divisions that had torn the world apart, offering a vision of what human relationships might look like without the artificial barriers that war created. Their final week together became a study in careful restraint and growing desperation. Every medical procedure became an excuse for extended contact. Every routine check became an opportunity for conversation that neither wanted to end. They spoke about books they had read, places they hoped to visit after the war, dreams that felt increasingly impossible as reality pressed in around them. The night before Klaus's scheduled transfer, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She couldn't let him disappear into the general prisoner population without acknowledging what had developed between them, without at least attempting to understand whether the connection they had discovered could survive the circumstances that had created it. What happened next would test every assumption about loyalty and duty, about the boundaries between personal conscience and military obligation, about whether love could possibly exist between people whose nations demanded they see each other as mortal enemies. The decision Sarah made that night would haunt her for the rest of her life, though not for the reasons she initially feared. As the desert air cooled and the medical ward settled into its evening quiet, she found herself standing beside Klaus's bed with a small package wrapped in medical gauze. Inside was a book of American poetry, the same collection of Walt Whitman verses that had sparked their first real conversation weeks earlier. But this wasn't simply a gesture of friendship. Hidden between the pages, written on strips of bandage material in her careful handwriting, were words that could have ended her military career, and possibly her life if discovered. Sarah had written Klaus a letter explaining everything she couldn't say during their carefully monitored conversations. Her thoughts about duty and conscience, her growing respect for the man behind the enemy uniform, her bewilderment at finding connection where she had expected only professional obligation. Klaus accepted the package with hands that trembled slightly, understanding immediately the enormous risk Sarah was taking. In a world where fraternization with enemy personnel was considered treason, where military tribunals had ended careers for far less serious infractions, she was offering him something that transcended the boundaries of war itself: trust, recognition of his humanity, acknowledgement that what had grown between them mattered enough to risk everything she had worked to achieve. That night, by the dim light of a single bulb in the prisoner ward, Klaus read Sarah's words over and over again. She wrote about her brother's death and how hatred had crystallized in her heart, only to be slowly dissolved by conversations with someone who should have been her enemy. She described the way their discussions of literature and philosophy had reminded her of who she had been before the war, before military service had taught her to see the world in terms of us and them. Most remarkably, Sarah had written about her growing conviction that individual human connections might be more powerful than the political forces that sought to divide people into opposing camps. She wondered whether Klaus felt the same confusion about duty and personal conscience, whether their conversations had affected him as profoundly as they had changed her understanding of what it meant to heal in wartime. Klaus spent hours composing his response on scraps of paper he managed to gather from various sources throughout the ward. His letter, written in English that grew more fluent and emotional as he continued, revealed a man torn between loyalty to his crew and country, and a growing recognition that some bonds transcended national allegiance. He wrote about nights spent on submarine duty, staring at stars that looked the same whether viewed from German or American territory, wondering if the enemy sailors he was hunting might be looking at those same constellations and thinking similar thoughts about the futility of war. The exchange of letters became a dangerous ritual that continued even after Klaus was transferred to the general prisoner population. Sarah would find ways to visit the compound on medical rounds, ostensibly checking on former patients, but actually maintaining a connection that both knew violated every protocol governing prisoner-guard relationships. Klaus would leave responses hidden in predetermined locations, using a system of coded signals they had developed to avoid detection by guards or fellow prisoners who might report suspicious behavior. Their correspondence revealed depths of feeling that neither had expected when their relationship began as a simple matter of medical treatment. Sarah wrote about sleepless nights spent questioning her purpose as a military nurse, wondering whether healing enemy soldiers made her complicit in extending a war that was consuming young lives on both sides. Klaus responded with his own struggles about submarine warfare, describing the weight of commanding attacks on merchant vessels that might be carrying medical supplies or food for civilian populations. What emerged through their secret letters was a shared understanding that war created impossible moral choices for anyone who maintained enough conscience to question their actions. Both had been raised with clear principles about right and wrong, only to find themselves serving systems that demanded compromises their peacetime selves would have found unthinkable. Their connection became a lifeline to the people they had been before uniforms, and duties had complicated their understanding of morality. The risks they were taking became increasingly apparent as camp security tightened in response to intelligence about potential escape attempts. Guards began conducting more thorough searches of prisoner quarters and monitoring interactions between staff and inmates with greater scrutiny. Sarah noticed the way certain colleagues watched her movements during compound visits, the questions that seemed casual but probed for information about her activities and motivations. Klaus faced dangers from multiple directions. Fellow prisoners had begun to notice his extended stays in the medical ward and the unusual attention he received from American staff. Some suspected him of collaboration, of providing intelligence to his captors in exchange for preferential treatment. Others wondered whether his submarine command had involved war crimes that made him valuable to American interrogators. The isolation he felt among his own countrymen made his connection to Sarah even more precious and more perilous. Their letters began to address the growing pressure both felt to end their correspondence before discovery brought consequences neither could control. Sarah wrote about transfer orders that might relocate her to different facilities, effectively severing their contact. Klaus described interrogation sessions that probed deeper into his background and beliefs, suggesting that authorities suspected his loyalty to the Nazi cause was less than absolute. Yet instead of pulling back from the dangerous connection they had forged, both found themselves drawn deeper into a relationship that had evolved far beyond professional interest or even friendship. Sarah's letters began to reveal feelings she had never expected to experience for anyone, let alone an enemy prisoner. She wrote about the way Klaus's thoughtful questions had awakened intellectual passions she thought military service had permanently buried, about conversations that made her feel more alive than she had since before her brother's death. Klaus responded with equal honesty about emotions that complicated his understanding of loyalty and duty. He described counting the days between Sarah's visits to the compound, about memorizing her handwriting as carefully as he had once studied navigation charts. Their correspondence had become the most meaningful relationship either had experienced, built on shared values that transcended the artificial divisions war had created between their nations. The turning point in their relationship came when Sarah received news that would force both of them to confront the ultimate test of their connection. Orders had arrived reassigning her to a military hospital in California, effective within 2 weeks. The transfer represented a promotion and recognition of her exceptional service, but it also meant the end of any possibility for continued contact with Klaus. Sarah's letter informing Klaus of her impending departure was the most difficult she had ever written. She described her devastation at the prospect of separation, her disbelief that military bureaucracy could so casually destroy something that had become essential to her existence. But she also wrote about a decision she was considering, a choice that would require courage she wasn't certain she possessed. Klaus read her words with growing amazement and terror. Sarah was contemplating refusing the transfer orders, a decision that would end her military career and potentially result in court-martial proceedings. She was willing to sacrifice everything she had worked to achieve rather than abandon the connection they had built in defiance of every rule governing their interaction. His response revealed the depth of feeling that had grown between them over months of secret correspondence. Klaus begged Sarah not to destroy her future for his sake, arguing that her medical skills served a greater purpose than their personal relationship. Yet he also wrote with raw emotion about what her presence had meant to him, about how their conversations had sustained him through the darkest periods of imprisonment. The letters they exchanged during those final weeks revealed two people grappling with impossible choices between duty and heart, between the lives they had built and the connection they had discovered. Sarah wrote about dreams that seemed increasingly real, visions of a world where their relationship could exist openly, where the barriers between them would dissolve along with the war that had created those divisions. Klaus responded with his own impossible dreams, describing a future where they might walk together without guards or barbed wire, where their conversations could happen in sunlight rather than hidden shadows. He wrote about introducing Sarah to the Bavarian village where he had grown up, showing her the mountains and forests that had shaped his understanding of beauty before submarine duty had shown him the ocean's darker possibilities. Yet both understood that such dreams required not just the end of the current war, but a fundamental transformation in how the world understood the relationship between former enemies. Klaus would likely face years of imprisonment even after hostilities ended, followed by repatriation to a Germany that might no longer exist in any recognizable form. Sarah would return to civilian life carrying the secret of a relationship that most of her countrymen would consider treasonous. Their correspondence became increasingly urgent as Sarah's departure date approached. They wrote about memories they wanted to preserve, conversations they wished they could have, promises they dared not make but couldn't help hoping might someday be fulfilled. Each letter felt like both a treasure and a farewell, precious because it might be the last opportunity for communication between two people whose connection had transcended every boundary that circumstances had placed between them. The night before Sarah's departure, she made one final visit to the prisoner compound. Officially, she was conducting medical rounds to ensure continuity of care for patients she had been treating. In reality, she was saying goodbye to someone who had changed her understanding of what it meant to be human in wartime, someone whose influence would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. What neither Sarah nor Klaus could have anticipated was that their story was far from over. The war that had brought them together was entering its final phases, and the chaos of victory and defeat would create opportunities neither had dared to imagine. Their connection, forged in secrecy and sustained by courage, was about to face tests that would determine whether love discovered in the shadows of conflict could survive in the harsh light of peacetime reality. Klaus stood at the window of his barracks that night, staring through the chain-link fence at the medical building, where a light still burned in Sarah's office. He knew she was there, probably finishing patient reports and preparing transfer documentation for her replacement. The knowledge that this was their last night in the same place felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. What he couldn't see was Sarah sitting at her desk, surrounded by medical files she couldn't concentrate on reading. In her hands was a letter she had written and rewritten a dozen times, words that seemed inadequate to capture everything she wanted Klaus to know before their separation became permanent. The letter contained more than just goodbye. Hidden within seemingly innocent observations about his recovery progress were coded messages about her transfer timeline and a proposal that would require both of them to risk everything they had left. The plan Sarah had conceived during sleepless nights was audacious, beyond anything she had previously contemplated. Rather than simply accepting separation, she was suggesting they attempt to maintain contact through a network of sympathetic medical personnel who rotated between different facilities. Nurses and doctors who had witnessed the human cost of war might be willing to carry messages between former colleagues, especially if those messages appeared to concern ongoing medical care for transferred patients. But Sarah's letter contained something even more dangerous. She had been researching Klaus's background through official channels accessible to medical staff, ostensibly to better understand treatments he might require. What she had discovered was information that could change everything about his situation, details about his submarine service that painted a very different picture from what his capture reports suggested. Klaus had been pulled from the Atlantic not after his submarine was destroyed in combat, but after he had surrendered his vessel to prevent civilian casualties. Intelligence reports buried in classified files revealed that Klaus had refused direct orders to attack a clearly marked hospital ship, choosing instead to surface and surrender, rather than fire on a vessel carrying wounded personnel from both sides of the conflict. This information meant Klaus wasn't just another captured enemy officer. He was someone who had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that transcended national allegiance, someone whose actions had saved lives regardless of which flag those lives served under. Sarah realized that this knowledge could be the key to changing Klaus's status from prisoner of war to something approaching a protected witness, someone whose cooperation with Allied intelligence might earn him consideration for early release or transfer to more favorable conditions. The weight of this discovery had kept Sarah awake for days as she grappled with the implications. Revealing what she knew would mean admitting she had conducted unauthorized research into Klaus's background, potentially exposing their relationship to official scrutiny. But keeping the information secret might mean allowing someone who had already demonstrated extraordinary moral courage to disappear into the prisoner system without anyone understanding his true character. Klaus received Sarah's final letter through their established system of dead drops, finding it hidden beneath a loose board in the chapel where he had been attending services. The building provided one of the few spaces where prisoners could spend time without constant guard supervision, and Klaus had discovered that certain maintenance areas offered opportunities for concealing and retrieving messages. Reading Sarah's words by candlelight in the empty chapel, Klaus felt his world shift in ways he hadn't experienced since the moment his submarine had surfaced in surrender. Sarah wasn't just saying goodbye. She was offering him hope for a future that extended beyond the barbed wire and guard towers that currently defined his existence. More importantly, she was revealing that she understood the choice he had made in the Atlantic, the decision that had ended his naval career, but preserved his ability to look at himself in the mirror. The plan Sarah proposed was complex enough to have a chance of success, while remaining simple enough to avoid the complications that had doomed other prisoner communication networks. Medical personnel transferred between facilities routinely carried patient files and treatment recommendations. Letters discussing ongoing care requirements would attract little attention from censors who focused primarily on escape plans and intelligence gathering rather than medical continuity. Klaus's response, written over several nights and hidden in the same chapel location, revealed both his gratitude for Sarah's understanding and his concern about the risk she was proposing to take. He wrote about fellow prisoners who had been transferred to harsher conditions after authorities discovered unauthorized communications, about the way suspicion could spread through entire compounds when security breaches were uncovered. Yet Klaus also wrote about the hope Sarah's letter had awakened in him, feelings he had thought were buried permanently beneath months of imprisonment and uncertainty about his future. Her recognition of the moral choice he had made in surrendering his submarine meant more than any military decoration or official commendation could have provided. For the first time since his capture, Klaus felt that someone truly understood the person he had tried to remain despite the impossible circumstances war had created. The correspondence network Sarah had envisioned began operating within weeks of her transfer to California. Dr. Margaret Chen, a Navy psychiatrist who had worked closely with Sarah in Arizona, agreed to carry messages after learning about Klaus's surrender circumstances through Sarah's carefully worded requests for patient follow-up information. Dr. Chen had spent enough time treating combat trauma to understand that moral injury often caused more lasting damage than physical wounds, and she recognized Klaus as someone whose conscience had survived the war intact. Through this network, Sarah learned that Klaus had been transferred to a facility in Colorado that specialized in housing officers who possessed technical knowledge valuable to Allied intelligence services. His submarine expertise made him useful for ongoing operations against remaining German naval assets, but his cooperation was voluntary rather than coerced. Klaus had agreed to provide information about submarine construction and tactics in exchange for improved living conditions and the possibility of shortened imprisonment. Klaus's letters, carried by medical personnel who rotated between facilities, revealed someone adapting to circumstances he had never expected to face. Working with Allied naval intelligence forced him to confront the full scope of the war his submarine service had supported. Details about civilian casualties and strategic destruction that his isolated position underwater had shielded him from understanding. The knowledge was painful but also liberating, confirming his intuition that the cause he had served was fundamentally wrong. The intelligence work also provided Klaus with purpose that imprisonment alone could never offer. His technical expertise was helping Allied forces locate and neutralize remaining German submarines, potentially saving lives on both sides by shortening the war's duration. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest contribution to ending the conflict might come not from his service as a German officer, but from his cooperation with former enemies who had become something approaching colleagues. Sarah's work at the California facility, was consuming in ways that helped distract her from the pain of separation, while providing new perspectives on the war's human cost. The hospital treated casualties from Pacific theater operations, soldiers whose injuries and trauma reflected different aspects of the same global conflict that had brought her and Klaus together. Treating American servicemen who had been captured and tortured by Japanese forces gave Sarah deeper appreciation for the complexity of wartime morality, the way circumstances could transform ordinary people into victims or perpetrators regardless of their fundamental character. The letters she exchanged with Klaus through their medical network became lifelines that sustained both of them through the war's final chaotic months. Sarah wrote about patients whose stories reminded her of Klaus's moral struggles, American soldiers who had been forced to make impossible choices between duty and conscience. Klaus responded with observations about his fellow prisoners, German officers grappling with the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe about their cause and their country. Their correspondence revealed two people whose understanding of war and peace was evolving through their separation in ways that proximity might never have allowed. Sarah's exposure to Pacific theater casualties broadened her comprehension of the war's global scope, while reinforcing her belief that individual conscience could transcend national allegiance. Klaus's intelligence work provided him with strategic perspectives that confirmed his intuitive sense that the conflict had become a struggle between fundamentally different visions of human dignity. As 1945 progressed and Allied victory became inevitable, both Sarah and Klaus began contemplating a future neither had dared imagine during the darkest days of their separation. Klaus's cooperation with intelligence services had earned him consideration for early release and potential immigration to the United States under programs designed to recruit German technical experts. Sarah's medical service had qualified her for advanced training opportunities that could lead to civilian positions in research hospitals or international relief organizations. The possibility that they might actually have a future together remained unspoken in their letters, too precious and too fragile to examine directly. Both understood that Klaus's prisoner status could continue for years even after the war ended, that Sarah's military career might take her to assignments anywhere in the world, that the social barriers between former enemies would persist long after formal hostilities ceased. Yet their correspondence had evolved beyond mere friendship into something that felt permanent and unshakable despite the circumstances that separated them. Sarah wrote about Klaus's influence on her understanding of healing, the way their conversations had taught her to see patients as complete human beings rather than just medical cases. Klaus responded with descriptions of how Sarah's example had shaped his cooperation with Allied intelligence, showing him that service to human welfare could transcend service to any particular government or ideology. The network of medical personnel carrying their messages had grown into something approaching an underground railroad for maintaining connections that official military policy would never have permitted. Dr. Chen had recruited other physicians and nurses who understood that healing sometimes required preserving relationships that transcended the artificial divisions war created between people. These medical professionals saw themselves as serving something larger than military efficiency, something that recognized the fundamental humanity connecting all their patients regardless of which uniform those patients had worn. Klaus's intelligence work had progressed to the point where he was collaborating directly with American submarine commanders on operations designed to locate and rescue German sailors from vessels that had been sunk or damaged in the war's final battles. The irony of a former German submarine commander working to save the lives of his former comrades, while cooperating with his former enemies, was not lost on anyone involved in these operations. But Klaus's technical expertise and genuine concern for civilian casualties made him invaluable to efforts aimed at minimizing further bloodshed. The rescue operations provided Klaus with opportunities to demonstrate that his moral courage extended beyond dramatic gestures like surrendering his submarine. Working with Allied forces to save German lives required him to balance loyalty to his former comrades with cooperation with their captors, navigating complex ethical territory that had no clear guidelines or precedents. Klaus's letters to Sarah described these missions as the most meaningful work he had performed since his naval service began, finally allowing him to use his military skills to preserve life rather than destroy it. Sarah's medical work had evolved as well, expanding beyond traditional nursing duties to include psychological counseling for servicemen struggling with combat trauma and moral injury. Her conversations with Klaus had prepared her to understand the internal conflicts that arose when duty and conscience collided, making her uniquely qualified to help soldiers process experiences that challenged their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. The approach Sarah developed for treating moral injury drew heavily on insights gained through her correspondence with Klaus about the possibility of maintaining personal integrity, even within systems that demanded ethical compromises. She helped American servicemen understand that questioning their actions didn't make them traitors or cowards, that moral sensitivity could coexist with military effectiveness, that healing sometimes required acknowledging the full complexity of wartime choices, rather than simply accepting official justifications for necessary evils. As spring arrived in 1945, bringing with it news of German surrender and the beginning of the end for the global conflict that had shaped their lives, both Sarah and Klaus found themselves preparing for transitions neither had expected to survive. Klaus's cooperation with Allied intelligence had earned him preliminary approval for immigration to the United States under technical expert provisions, though final processing could take months or years, depending on security clearances and bureaucratic procedures. Sarah had been offered positions with several civilian medical organizations, including the International Red Cross and a university research hospital that specialized in treating combat trauma. The opportunities represented everything she had dreamed of accomplishing through her medical career, chances to heal on a scale that military service had never permitted, while maintaining the kind of intellectual engagement her conversations with Klaus had shown her she craved. Yet both understood that their future remained uncertain in ways that went far beyond professional opportunities or immigration procedures. The connection they had forged in secret would have to survive in a world where their relationship might be viewed with suspicion by people who couldn't understand how healing could transcend the boundaries that war had created between former enemies. Their letters during this transitional period reflected both hope and apprehension about what lay ahead. Sarah wrote about dreams of working alongside Klaus in some capacity that utilized both their skills and their shared understanding of war's human cost. Klaus responded with careful optimism about the possibility of building a life in America while contributing to efforts aimed at preventing future conflicts through international cooperation and understanding. The war that had brought them together was ending, but the story of what they had discovered in each other was just beginning to unfold. Whether their connection could survive the transition from wartime secrecy to peacetime reality remained to be seen, but both had been transformed by the experience in ways that would influence every choice they made for the rest of their lives. The nurse and the captive officer had found something in each other that transcended every barrier the world had placed between them, something that might just prove stronger than the forces that had tried to keep them apart. The transition from war to peace brought unexpected challenges that neither Sarah nor Klaus had anticipated during their months of secret correspondence. The Allied victory celebrations that filled American streets with joy and relief felt strangely hollow to Sarah as she watched from her hospital window in California. The end of hostilities meant liberation for millions, but for her, it represented the beginning of an even more uncertain phase in her relationship with Klaus. The intelligence work that had protected Klaus during the war's final months suddenly became a double-edged sword in peacetime. His cooperation with Allied submarine operations had earned him consideration for immigration, but it also marked him as a collaborator in the eyes of other German prisoners who were being processed for repatriation. Klaus found himself isolated between two worlds, trusted by neither his former countrymen nor fully accepted by his American handlers, who still viewed him primarily as a valuable asset rather than a human being seeking refuge. Sarah's letters during this period revealed her growing frustration with military bureaucracy that seemed designed to prevent the kind of human connections that had sustained her through the war's darkest moments. The medical network that had carried their correspondence was being dismantled as personnel received discharge orders and transferred to civilian positions. Dr. Chen had been reassigned to a veterans hospital on the East Coast, severing one of the most reliable communication links between Sarah and Klaus. The prospect of losing contact entirely forced both of them to confront feelings they had carefully avoided examining during the relative safety of wartime separation. Sarah's letters became more direct about emotions she had been expressing through coded language and medical terminology. She wrote about sleepless nights spent wondering whether Klaus would disappear into the immigration system without her ever knowing his final destination, whether their connection could survive the loss of the structured framework that had enabled their correspondence. Klaus responded with equal honesty about fears that extended beyond simple concern about maintaining contact with Sarah. The immigration process required him to provide detailed accounts of his military service, including decisions like surrendering his submarine that could be interpreted as either moral courage or tactical cowardice, depending on the political climate. Klaus worried that changing attitudes toward former enemy personnel might result in his application being denied, leaving him stranded in a prisoner system that no longer had clear guidelines for long-term detention. The psychological pressure of uncertainty began affecting both of them in ways their letters couldn't fully capture. Sarah's colleagues noticed changes in her behavior that went beyond normal post-war adjustment difficulties. Her legendary dedication to patient care remained intact, but the intensity that had once characterized her interactions with wounded soldiers had evolved into something more detached and clinical. She performed her duties with mechanical precision, while reserving her emotional energy for the letters that represented her only remaining connection to the person who had awakened parts of herself she thought the war had destroyed. Klaus faced different but equally challenging adjustments as he navigated the complex bureaucracy of prisoner processing and immigration screening. American officials conducting his interviews seemed unable to categorize someone whose military record included both exemplary naval service and moral decisions that had ultimately aided Allied objectives. Klaus found himself repeatedly explaining choices that felt self-evident to him, but appeared contradictory to administrators who expected former enemy personnel to fit neatly into predetermined categories of cooperation or resistance. The intelligence community that had valued Klaus's technical expertise during wartime seemed less certain about his usefulness in peacetime applications. Submarine warfare was becoming increasingly obsolete as nuclear weapons and long-range aircraft changed the strategic landscape, making Klaus's specialized knowledge less immediately relevant to ongoing defense projects. The bureaucrats processing his immigration application began questioning whether his skills justified the security risks associated with granting permanent residence to a former enemy officer. Sarah's position was complicated by her own military service record, which had become intertwined with Klaus's case in ways that attracted unwanted attention from security investigators. Her research into Klaus's background during his medical treatment had been noted in various files, and her subsequent transfer requests had followed patterns that suggested ongoing interest in his welfare. Military intelligence officers conducting routine security reviews had begun asking questions about her motivations and contact patterns that made Sarah realize how precarious their situation had become. The investigation that followed was conducted with the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized post-war security procedures. Sarah found herself summoned to interviews that probed every aspect of her interaction with Klaus, from the medical treatment decisions that had extended his hospital stay to the research she had conducted into his military background. The investigators seemed particularly interested in the timing of her transfer requests and her communications with medical personnel at facilities where Klaus had been housed. Klaus faced parallel scrutiny as investigators attempted to determine whether his cooperation with Allied intelligence had been genuine or part of some elaborate deception designed to infiltrate American defense systems. His technical expertise that had once been viewed as an asset now appeared potentially dangerous to security officials who worried about former enemy personnel gaining access to sensitive information about American naval capabilities. The investigation process created a cruel irony that neither Sarah nor Klaus had anticipated. The very qualities that had drawn them together, their shared commitment to preserving human dignity in impossible circumstances, were being interpreted as potential evidence of disloyalty or deception. Sarah's compassionate treatment of enemy prisoners was viewed with suspicion by investigators who wondered whether her medical decisions had been influenced by personal feelings rather than professional judgment. Klaus's moral courage in surrendering his submarine rather than attacking civilian vessels was being re-examined as potentially calculated manipulation, designed to create favorable conditions for post-war cooperation. The investigators seemed unable to comprehend that someone might make significant sacrifices based purely on ethical principles rather than strategic considerations, that moral decisions could be genuine rather than tactical maneuvers designed to achieve long-term advantages. The stress of investigation began taking its toll on both Sarah and Klaus in ways that their limited correspondence could only hint at. Sarah's letters became more guarded as she realized that all her communications were likely being monitored by security personnel, looking for evidence of inappropriate relationships or security breaches. The spontaneous emotional honesty that had characterized their wartime correspondence gave way to carefully constructed messages that said little while attempting to convey everything through subtle implications and shared references to previous conversations. Klaus found himself in an even more precarious position as the investigation progressed. His cooperation with American intelligence had isolated him from other German prisoners who viewed him as a traitor, while his enemy background made him suspect to American officials who questioned his motivations and reliability. The liminal space between enemy and ally that had once provided opportunities for meaningful contribution to peace efforts now felt like a trap that offered no clear path toward resolution or acceptance. The turning point in their situation came through an unexpected source that neither had considered during their months of careful correspondence. Captain James Morrison, the submarine commander who had worked most closely with Klaus during intelligence operations, submitted a detailed report to the Immigration Review Board describing Klaus's contributions to rescue missions that had saved dozens of German sailors from sinking vessels. Morrison's testimony provided concrete examples of Klaus's commitment to preserving life, regardless of national allegiance, demonstrating that his moral principles extended beyond dramatic gestures to consistent patterns of behavior under pressure. Morrison's report was accompanied by testimonials from rescued German sailors who had been repatriated and were now providing statements about Klaus's character and motivations. These testimonies painted a picture of someone whose surrender of his submarine had been consistent with a long pattern of decisions prioritizing human welfare over military objectives, someone whose cooperation with Allied forces had been motivated by genuine desire to minimize casualties rather than self-serving calculation. Sarah's situation began to improve when Dr. Chen, now working at a veterans hospital, provided testimony about the medical network that had carried correspondence between separated personnel. Dr. Chen's report described the psychological benefits of maintaining human connections during wartime separation, presenting Sarah's involvement as consistent with recognized therapeutic approaches to treating isolation and moral injury, rather than evidence of security breaches or inappropriate relationships. The investigation's conclusion vindicated both Sarah and Klaus, while revealing the complexity of human relationships that transcended the simple categories bureaucratic systems preferred to maintain. Klaus's immigration application was approved with restrictions that required him to work under government supervision for an initial period, but he was granted the opportunity to build a life in America while contributing to defense projects that aligned with his technical expertise and moral principles. Sarah received clearance to continue her medical career in civilian capacity while maintaining her military reserve commission. The investigation had actually enhanced her reputation among medical professionals, who recognized her innovative approaches to treating combat trauma and moral injury, leading to offers from several prestigious institutions seeking personnel experienced in dealing with the psychological aftermath of warfare. The clearance process that had seemed designed to separate them permanently had instead created opportunities for reunion that neither had dared hope for during their darkest moments of uncertainty. Klaus's supervised employment was located at a research facility in Colorado that collaborated closely with the California hospital, where Sarah had been offered a position studying combat trauma. The geographical proximity wasn't accidental. Administrators who had investigated their relationship had concluded that their connection represented a valuable asset rather than a security risk. The reunion that followed was unlike anything either had imagined during their months of separation and uncertainty. Meeting in person after communicating primarily through letters required them to navigate the gap between the intimate intellectual connection they had developed and the physical reality of two people whose relationship had been forged entirely in crisis circumstances. Klaus appeared older than Sarah had expected, marked by months of imprisonment and investigation stress, but his eyes held the same gentle intelligence that had first attracted her attention in the Arizona medical ward. Sarah had changed as well, her legendary composure tempered by experiences that had tested her faith in military institutions, while strengthening her commitment to healing as a practice that transcended political boundaries. The confidence that had once characterized her medical work had evolved into something deeper and more complex, an understanding of human nature that encompassed both the capacity for extraordinary cruelty and the potential for unexpected grace. Their first conversations in person felt awkward in ways their letters never had, both of them struggling to reconcile the intimate intellectual connection they had maintained through correspondence with the social protocols that governed interaction between people whose relationship had been forged in circumstances that no longer existed. Klaus found himself reverting to the formal courtesy that had characterized his early interactions with Sarah, uncertain how to behave towards someone who had become essential to his emotional survival, but whom he had never been permitted to know in normal social circumstances. Sarah experienced similar discomfort as she realized that her feelings for Klaus, developed through letters that revealed his thoughts and character, had to be recalibrated to accommodate his physical presence and the social dynamics that correspondence had allowed them to avoid. The intellectual attraction that had sustained their relationship through months of separation was undoubtedly real, but translating that connection into face-to-face interaction required skills neither had developed during their careful written courtship. The adjustment period that followed tested their relationship in ways that wartime separation never had. Klaus was struggling to adapt to civilian life after years of military service followed by imprisonment, trying to understand American social customs while working in technical fields that utilized his expertise, but required him to collaborate with people who still viewed him with suspicion, despite his official clearance. Sarah was navigating her own transition from military to civilian medical practice, learning to work within institutional structures that operated according to different principles than the crisis-driven environment where she had developed her professional identity. Their relationship during this period was sustained by the intellectual connection that had originally drawn them together, but it required constant renegotiation as they discovered aspects of each other's personalities that letters had never revealed. Klaus's dry sense of humor, barely visible during his imprisonment, emerged as a defense mechanism against the social awkwardness he felt as a former enemy trying to build relationships with American colleagues. Sarah's fierce independence, evident in her willingness to risk her career for their correspondence, sometimes conflicted with Klaus's protective instincts developed during years of military command responsibility. The research work that had brought them to the same geographical area provided opportunities for professional collaboration that gradually eased the personal tensions created by their unusual circumstances. Sarah's studies of combat trauma benefited from Klaus's insights into the psychological effects of submarine warfare, while his technical projects gained depth from her understanding of how stress and moral injury affected performance under pressure. Working together on projects that utilized both their expertise allowed them to rediscover the intellectual partnership that had characterized their correspondence, while building new forms of intimacy based on shared professional accomplishments. The collaboration revealed aspects of their relationship that pure correspondence could never have developed. Sarah discovered that Klaus's careful precision in written communication translated into meticulous attention to detail in research methodology, making him an invaluable partner in studies that required analyzing complex psychological data. Klaus found that Sarah's compassionate approach to treating trauma informed her research in ways that produced insights unavailable to investigators who viewed their subjects purely as sources of data, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Their professional partnership gradually evolved into something more personal, as they learned to navigate the social complexities that had been absent from their wartime correspondence. Klaus's integration into American society was facilitated by Sarah's understanding of cultural nuances that his technical training hadn't addressed, while her research benefited from his perspective on international conflicts that informed her approaches to treating veterans whose trauma stemmed from encounters with foreign cultures and belief systems. The relationship that emerged from this period of adjustment was different from what either had envisioned during their months of separation, but it was also more substantial and realistic than the idealized connection they had maintained through letters. Klaus had learned to appreciate Sarah's strength and independence as assets that complemented rather than competed with his own capabilities, while Sarah had discovered that Klaus's formal courtesy masked emotional depths that made their intellectual connection even more meaningful. The work they were doing together had implications that extended far beyond their personal relationship, contributing to understanding of how human connections could transcend the artificial boundaries that political conflicts created between people. Sarah's research was producing new approaches to treating moral injury that recognized the complexity of wartime decision-making, while Klaus's technical contributions were informing defense projects designed to minimize civilian casualties in future conflicts. Their collaboration represented something unprecedented in post-war America, a partnership between former enemies that demonstrated the possibility of transforming conflict into cooperation through shared commitment to human welfare. The success of their professional relationship was attracting attention from government officials and academic institutions interested in replicating their model of international cooperation in other contexts. Yet personal challenges remained as both struggled with the social isolation that resulted from their unusual circumstances. Klaus's status as a former enemy made him suspect to some Americans who couldn't understand how someone who had served the Nazi regime could be trusted with sensitive work, while Sarah faced criticism from military colleagues who questioned her judgment in developing relationships with former prisoners. The prejudices they encountered required them to develop resilience and mutual support that strengthened their personal bond while contributing to their professional effectiveness. The future they were building together was unlike anything either had imagined during the dark days of war and separation, but it was also more substantial and hopeful than the dreams that had sustained them through their correspondence. Klaus was discovering that his technical expertise could serve humanitarian purposes that aligned with his moral principles, while Sarah was learning that healing could extend beyond individual patients to encompass the social wounds that war had created between former enemies. Their story was becoming something larger than a personal relationship, evolving into a demonstration of how individual connections could transcend the hatred that had divided nations and peoples. The nurse and the captive officer had found in each other not just love, but a model for the kind of understanding that would be necessary to prevent future conflicts from consuming another generation of young people who deserved better than the world their elders had created for them. The work they shared became a bridge between worlds that had seemed irreconcilably divided just months before. Klaus found himself consulting on submarine rescue protocols that could save lives regardless of which nation's flag the vessels flew under. Sarah developed treatment programs for prisoners of war suffering from moral injury, understanding better than anyone how conscience could survive even within systems designed to crush individual thought and feeling. Their research began attracting international attention as word spread about the former German submarine commander and American military nurse, whose collaboration was producing breakthrough insights into trauma recovery and conflict resolution. Universities across Europe sent delegations to observe their methods, while military medical programs incorporated their findings into training curricula designed to prepare future generations of medical personnel for the psychological complexities of modern warfare. The recognition brought unexpected challenges as Klaus and Sarah found themselves thrust into public roles they had never sought. Klaus was invited to speak at international conferences about submarine warfare's human cost, while Sarah received offers to head trauma research programs at prestigious institutions. The attention was gratifying, but also overwhelming for two people whose relationship had been forged in secrecy and maintained through careful discretion. The public nature of their work forced them to confront questions about their relationship that they had been able to avoid during their private correspondence and early professional collaboration. Journalists began asking about their personal connection, wondering whether their professional partnership extended beyond academic interest. The scrutiny made both of them uncomfortable, particularly Klaus, who remained sensitive about his status as a former enemy seeking acceptance in American society. Their love story proves that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual conscience can triumph over institutional hatred. Sarah and Klaus discovered something more powerful than the forces that tried to divide them, a connection that transformed two strangers into partners who would spend their lives healing the wounds that war had created. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't found on any battlefield, but in the quiet courage of two hearts that refused to see enemies where they found human beings instead.